Hello and welcome to this feature interview. I'm Emily Carrier. The Mass Communications Department has a new leader, a first-year assistant professor at Emory and Henry with a unique field of research. Mass Communication Department Chair Dr. Mark Finney. Thank you for joining me on the Allen set.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Now you come to us from Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
What brought you and your family to Virginia?
Well, I grew up in Virginia. I grew up in Roanoke, and I was at Adams State University in Alamosa, Colorado, and we were thinking about a change, and we just sort of started looking around and saw an ad at Emory and Henry College and decided to give it a shot.
And tell me about the major similarities and differences between the campus you come to from Colorado and Emory and Henry.
Well, both are small campuses. Both are oriented towards liberal arts. Both are concerned with serving their regional populations, more so at least than in getting populations from everywhere else. So I would say those are the things that are pretty similar about them. Both are very student-centered.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the differences you've noticed?
Well, there are a lot of differences. Emory and Henry is about 100 years older than Adams State, and there are a lot more traditions here than there were at Adams State. Emory and Henry embraces the liberal arts in a way that is different than any other place that I've been to, actually. And that's something that I really found attractive about Emory and Henry when we came here.
Now tell me about your field of research. It's a little unique to our area.
Right. So, well, my first degree in mass communication was my doctorate. My undergraduate degree is in political science and international affairs, and I have a master's in conflict analysis and resolution. And while I was doing my master's, I started to look at the way that international conflict is represented in media, especially news coverage, and trying to figure out how news coverage affects international conflicts, or rather to look at the interrelationship between the coverage of a conflict and a conflict's trajectory. So I decided to go for a doctorate in mass communication so I could study in a more sophisticated way this relationship, and that's what I do now. My dissertation was looking at the representation of the Iraq War on CNN. It's also the topic of my book, which is a lot like my dissertation. And that's what I study these days. I have an article coming out soon, I hope, looking at the way that children were represented on CNN during the Iraq War, arguing that the representation of children is related to the way that we feel about the other, and in this case the other was Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi military. The way that they represent children affects the way that we feel about them, which affects the way that we feel about the conflict and the way that we behave in the conflict, especially with regards to whether we can trust the other, whether we feel like we can negotiate, or whether we have to do more extraordinary things to resolve the conflict.
I can tell you've got a lot of passion about this field of study and these issues. What really sparked your interest in this field?
Okay, that's sort of a long answer. I've been interested in international conflict since I was actually really young. I went to the Soviet Union when I was 14 years old, right before the Soviet Union ceased to exist, actually. And I was involved with a group of young people who wrote plays and produced plays about sort of intercultural understanding between Soviets and Americans during the Cold War. We met Soviet kids, we lived with them for a month, and we wrote and produced this play and traveled around Russia sort of doing this play while we were there. And it's always struck me that a lot of our international conflicts seem to be centered around misunderstanding, or centered around sort of political opportunism, both of those things in different ways. And my approach has always been to change the calculus in terms of understanding, to try to create humanity between different cultures rather than to create or destroy humanity, or to sort of make people. I've always been sort of oriented towards creating relationships and trying to help people understand how differences exist and why we're different and how we're similar, to prevent violence, because violence is a result of lack of humanity, I think. So that's really been my orientation, trying to understand different cultures and understand how people develop perspectives on other cultures and how those can be affected and changed over time.
In the course I took with you on covering conflicts and peace journalism, you really stress the importance of staying up to date on current events, of consuming news. Well, I'm curious, what is your preferred source of consuming news? Where do you get your news from?
Well, I am an NPR junkie. I also, okay, so I'm an NPR junkie. That's where I'm going to start. I also use social media, like Facebook in particular, as a news source. So I like NPR, the BBC, the Independent, the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I use those sources on Facebook to keep up to date. I think that maybe the most effective way that I keep up with news, though, is through podcasts. I subscribe to a dozen different news podcasts that aren't, the kinds of things that you would get on everybody's radio station, but are things that are interesting to me. So shows like On the Media are not broadcast in this area, but are really interesting, and so I subscribe to their podcast and listen to it weekly. Radio Lab, This American Life, these things, they're not all news-oriented necessarily, but they're interesting, and I think that they teach me things about people and culture and politics.
Well, Dr. Finney, thank you for joining me today and sharing your story and your views with me.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
I look forward to seeing the impact you make on the Mass Communications Department.
Me too.
And thank you for joining us. This has been your EHCtv feature interview. For Dr. Finney, I'm Emily Carrier, and now we'll send it over to Cole Conley with Tweet, Pray, Love.